Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that might make you appreciate your heated bedroom just a little bit more. Picture this: you're a medieval farmer, and outside your barn the first frost of the season is painting the world in deadly crystal patterns. Inside your breath forms clouds in the air, and you're about to spend the next 6 months sleeping in what's basically a wooden box filled with hay livestock and the constant threat of freezing to death. You probably won't survive this if you don't know exactly what you're doing, and even then it's touch and go. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up one October morning in 1347 and the world has changed overnight. The grass crunches under your feet like broken glass, and your breath hangs in the air like a ghostly warning. This isn't just another chilly morning. This is the first frost nature's way of announcing that the real battle is about to begin. For medieval farmers, this moment carried the weight of life and death decisions that had to be made immediately. Your summer sleeping arrangements are officially over. No more nights spent in the relative comfort of your cottage's main room, where the dying embers of the cooking fire might provide just enough warmth to keep hypothermia at bay. Winter means relocating to the barn, where you'll spend the next several months in what can only be described as the world's most primitive survival camp, complete with roommates who moo, bleat, and occasionally try to step on you in the dark. The barn wasn't just a building. It was your family's life insurance policy, carefully designed over generations of trial error and quite a few frozen ancestors who didn't get the engineering quite right. Every timber, every gap between boards, every angle of the roof had been calculated not by architects with fancy degrees, but by farmers whose lives depended on getting it right. One mistake in barn construction could mean waking up dead, which, as you might imagine, rather defeats the purpose of sleeping arrangements altogether. Medieval farming communities understood something that modern people have largely forgotten. Winter doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about your plans, your comfort, or your survival. It arrives with the indifferent persistence of a tax collector, and it will find every weakness in your defences. The difference between medieval farmers and modern people isn't that they were tougher, though they certainly were. It's that they had no choice but to develop strategies that actually worked. This first frost morning marks the beginning of a 6-month siege where the enemy is cold itself, creeping through every crack, stealing warmth from your body, and turning your breath into ice crystals that could damage your lungs if you breathed wrong. But medieval farmers had learned to fight back with weapons you might never have considered cow body heat. Strategic hay placement and sleeping arrangements that would make a modern person question their definition of personal space. Medieval barn architecture wasn't about aesthetics. It was about creating a structure that could keep both humans and animals alive through months of brutal cold. These weren't the picturesque red barns you see on postcards. They were survival bunkers disguised as farm buildings designed by people who understood that one architectural mistake could turn your livestock shelter into a frozen tomb by February. The foundation started with stone when possible, keeping the wooden structure elevated just enough to prevent ground moisture from rotting the timbers, but low enough that precious heat wouldn't escape underneath. Medieval builders had learned through generations of bitter experience that cold air loved nothing more than sneaking up through floorboards and turning your ankles into icicles while you slept. Some farmers actually dug their barns slightly into hillsides, creating a semi-underground shelter that took advantage of the earth's natural insulation. The walls were thick by necessity, not thick like modern insulation, but thick enough that 2 layers of wooden planks could be stuffed with whatever insulating material the farmer could gather. Dried moss was gold, straw was silver, even old rags and animal hair got packed between boards. Historians still argue whether this stuffing technique was more effective than solid timber construction, but farmers didn't have time for academic debates when winter was breathing down their necks. Windows were almost non-existent, and when they did exist, they were tiny openings covered with oiled animal hide or wooden shutters that could be sealed tighter than a Miser's purse. You might think this would make the barn unbearably dark, but remember, light wasn't the priority here. Heat retention was everything. A single large window could drain enough warmth to kill half your livestock and leave your family chattering their way to pneumonia. The roof design was perhaps the most crucial element. Too steep and snow would slide off, removing a valuable layer of insulation. Too flat and the weight of accumulated snow could collapse the entire structure, which tends to put a damper on your winter survival plans. Medieval carpenters developed roof angles that allowed just enough snow to accumulate for insulation, while preventing structural damage. The thatch itself was laid in overlapping layers so thick that water would run off without penetrating to the interior. Inside the barn was divided into distinct zones, though not with formal walls. The animals occupied the area closest to the door, partly because they needed access to the outside for obvious biological reasons, but mainly because their body heat would warm the entire structure. The human sleeping area was positioned as far from the door as possible, in what barn designers had learned was the warmest corner of the building. Some barns featured raised sleeping platforms built into the walls, creating a kind of medieval bunk bed system that took advantage of the fact that warm air rises. These platforms were usually just wooden planks covered with thick layers of straw, but they positioned sleeping humans several feet above the coldest floor-level air. The most ingenious farmers even built small alcoves into the walls, where children could sleep partially enclosed like human-sized bread ovens that trapped body heat. Ventilation was a delicate balance that could mean the difference between survival and suffocation. Too little airflow and carbon monoxide from both human respiration and animal breathing could accumulate to deadly levels. Too much ventilation, and all your carefully hoarded heat would escape into the night. Medieval barn builders developed systems of small high vents that allowed just enough air exchange to prevent poisoning while keeping the warm air trapped at human level. The barn door itself was an engineering masterpiece of survival. Double doors were common: an outer door that faced the weather and an inner door that created an airlock effect. Some farmers even built small entrance chambers like medieval mudrooms, where the worst of the cold could be trapped before it reached the main barn interior. These weren't conveniences. They were life-saving innovations developed by people who understood that every degree of heat lost was a step closer to disaster. When medieval farmers talked about their livestock, they weren't just discussing agricultural assets. They were describing their personal heating systems. A single cow generates roughly the same amount of heat as a small furnace pumping out around 500 BTUs per hour just by existing. In a world without central heating, that cow wasn't just producing milk and meat. She was your family's primary source of warmth, a one-tool's 200-pound radiator that happened to moo occasionally. The science behind animal heat banking was surprisingly sophisticated for people who supposedly lived in the Dark Ages. Medieval farmers understood that mammals maintain core body temperatures around 102 degrees Fahrenheit, significantly warmer than human body temperature. This meant that snuggling up to a cow wasn't just cozy, it was a legitimate survival strategy. The larger the animal, the more heat it generated, which explains why farmers with oxen or draft horses had better winter survival rates than those with only sheep or goats. Positioning was everything in the medieval barn heating system. Cows and oxen were placed in the centre of the barn's animal section, creating a warm core from which heat radiated outward. Smaller animals like sheep, goats, and pigs were arranged around the larger animals, forming concentric circles of warmth. Historians still argue whether farmers deliberately arranged their animals this way, or simply discovered the pattern through trial and error. But the results speak for themselves. Families with well-organised animal heat banks survived winters that killed their less strategic neighbours. The relationship between humans and animals in these barns went far beyond simple cohabitation. Farmers learned to read their animals' behaviour as weather predictors. When the cows huddled closer together, a temperature drop was coming. When the horses became restless, a storm was approaching. These weren't old wives' tales, they were empirically observed patterns that could provide hours or even days of advance warning before dangerous weather arrived. But living with your heating system came with challenges that modern people can barely imagine. First, there was the smell. Imagine spending 6 months in close quarters with animals that have zero concept of personal hygiene. The ammonia from urine, the methane from digestion, the general barnyard aroma that could probably be detected from neighbouring villages on calm days. Medieval farmers didn't just tolerate these smells, they learned to associate them with warmth and survival. Then there was the noise. Cows don't stop being cows just because it's bedtime. They chew cud with the rhythmic persistence of a medieval metronome. They shift their weight, causing timbers to creak. They occasionally decide that 3 a.m. is the perfect time for a lengthy conversation with the cow next to them. Sheep bleat, pigs grunt, chickens cluck even in their sleep, and horses have an uncanny ability to find the one loose board that squeaks every time they move. The most dangerous aspect of animal heat banking was the risk of being accidentally injured by your own heating system. A startled cow could easily crush a human, especially in the dark. Farmers developed careful protocols for moving around animals at night. Slow movements, gentle voices, and always maintaining contact so the animals knew where humans were located. Children were taught from early age never to surprise a sleeping animal, a lesson that could literally save their lives. Some families even developed primitive scheduling systems, taking turns sleeping closest to the animals for maximum warmth exposure. The warmest spot was often reserved for the youngest children or elderly family members, while healthy adults took the outer positions where they could monitor both the animals and the barn's security. This wasn't just kindness. It was practical survival strategy that kept the most vulnerable family members alive through the harshest months. Medieval farmers also discovered that different animals had different heat patterns throughout the night. Cows maintained steady temperatures while horses ran slightly warmer but were more restless sleepers. Pigs generated intense heat but were unpredictable companions. Sheep provided modest warmth but were excellent early warning systems for predators or weather changes. Understanding these patterns meant the difference between a comfortable night and waking up as a human popsicle. If medieval farmers had a motto, it might have been, "When in doubt, add more straw." This wasn't just about creating comfortable bedding, it was about building fortress walls of insulation that could trap heat and block the relentless advance of winter cold. Straw became the medieval equivalent of fiberglass insulation bubble wrap, and down comforters all rolled into one scratchy, occasionally mouse-infested package. The straw castle strategy began with understanding that air trapped between organic fibres was one of nature's best insulators. Medieval farmers didn't know the science behind thermal dynamics, but they absolutely knew that a thick layer of straw between them and the frozen ground meant the difference between waking up alive or waking up not at all. They would spend autumn days gathering every scrap of straw hay dried grass, and even reed materials they could find. Building the sleeping area was like constructing a nest for very large, very cold birds. First came the foundation layer, thick piles of straw spread directly on the barn floor, creating a mattress that was sometimes 3 feet deep. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about creating an insulating barrier between sleeping bodies and the earth, which could drain body heat faster than a medieval tax collector could empty your purse. Then came the wool construction. Bales of hay and loose straw were stacked around the sleeping area, creating barriers that rose as high as a person's chest. These weren't decorative, they were defensive fortifications against drafts that could sneak through barn walls and steal precious warmth. Some farmers even created multiple chambers within their barns, using straw bales to divide the space into smaller areas that could be heated more effectively by fewer bodies. The engineering of these straw castles was more sophisticated than you might expect. Farmers learned to pack the straw with different densities loose enough to trap air for insulation, but tight enough to prevent the whole structure from collapsing when someone rolled over in their sleep. They developed techniques for weaving longer pieces of straw through the bales to create structural stability, essentially building architectural elements out of agricultural waste. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers understood the concept of dead air space, but their straw arrangements clearly took advantage of this principle. Multiple layers of loosely packed straw created pockets of trapped air that couldn't circulate and carry heat away from sleeping bodies. The most skilled barn architects could create sleeping areas that were 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outside air temperature, a significant improvement when outside temperatures could drop well below freezing. The maintenance of straw castles was a constant winter chore. Straw compresses under weight, losing its insulating properties as air gets squeezed out. Farmers had to regularly fluff and rearrange their bedding, adding fresh straw to replace compressed areas. This wasn't just about comfort. Compressed straw lost most of its thermal protection, turning a warm sleeping spot into a cold trap that could lead to hypothermia. Moisture management was another critical aspect of straw castle engineering. Straw that became damp from human respiration or body moisture lost its insulating properties and could actually conduct heat away from the body. Medieval farmers developed techniques for rotating straw layers, moving damp material to the bottom, where it could dry out, while fresh dry straw moved to the top, where it would be in contact with sleeping bodies. The most ingenious farmers created modular straw systems that could be adjusted based on the severity of the weather. On moderately cold nights, they might use basic straw mattresses, but when Arctic conditions threatened, they could quickly construct elaborate straw fortresses with walls, roofs, and even crude doors made entirely from agricultural materials. These emergency structures could be built inside the barn in a matter of hours using pre-positioned materials. Some families even developed specialized straw arrangements for different family members. Children's sleeping areas might be built deeper into the straw castle, taking advantage of the warmest central positions. Adults might sleep on the perimeter where they could quickly respond to emergencies. Elderly family members often got the most elaborate straw constructions with extra layers and windbreaks that provided maximum thermal protection for bodies that generated less heat naturally. Medieval farming families discovered that when survival is on the line, personal space becomes a luxury you simply can't afford. The phrase "sleeping like sardines" doesn't even begin to capture the reality of how entire families, extended relatives, and sometimes even neighbours would pile together in barn sleeping areas, creating human heating systems that generated enough warmth to keep everyone alive through the darkest winter nights. Picture a sleeping arrangement that would make modern people claustrophobic just thinking about it. Parents, children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and anyone else who happened to be staying on the farm would arrange themselves in carefully orchestrated human puzzles. The youngest children were placed in the centre, surrounded by adults whose larger bodies generated more heat. Elderly family members who couldn't produce as much body heat were sandwiched between the warmest sleepers, creating thermal protection on all sides. This wasn't random pile-on chaos. Medieval families developed sophisticated sleeping strategies that maximized heat sharing while minimizing the risk of accidentally smothering someone in the night. Larger adults took the outside positions, acting as human windbreaks against any drafts that might penetrate the straw fortifications. Medium-sized family members formed the middle layer, and the smallest children occupied the warm core, where multiple bodies created a microclimate that could be 20 degrees warmer than the barn's ambient temperature. The sleeping positions themselves were carefully choreographed. Spooning wasn't just intimate, it was scientific. Bodies arranged so that each person's front warmed the next person's back, creating chains of heat transfer that kept warmth circulating through the entire group. Arms and legs were positioned to minimize gaps where cold air could penetrate, turning the family sleeping area into something resembling a human jigsaw puzzle, where every piece had to fit perfectly. Historians still argue whether medieval families found these arrangements comfortable or merely tolerable, but contemporary accounts suggest that people actually developed preferences for specific sleeping partners based on their heat generation and movement patterns. Children often fought over who got to sleep next to Uncle Robert, who apparently ran hot and stayed still all night, while avoiding Cousin Margaret, who kicked in her sleep and somehow always managed to steal more than her fair share of covering. The logistics of these arrangements required military-level coordination. Everyone had to go to sleep at roughly the same time because disturbing the human pile to accommodate a late sleeper could break the thermal seal and leave everyone shivering. Getting up in the middle of the night required careful extraction techniques that minimized heat loss for those remaining asleep. Some families even developed signal systems, gentle touches, or whispered codes that could communicate needs without waking the entire group. Clothing strategies added another layer of complexity to shared sleeping arrangements. Everyone slept fully clothed, often wearing every piece of clothing they owned layered together. This created additional insulation, but also meant that getting comfortable required negotiating not just with other people's bodies, but with multiple layers of wool, linen, and whatever other fabrics the family possessed. The scratchy, bulky clothing that kept them warm also made movement difficult and added to the challenge of finding comfortable positions. The psychological aspects of shared body warmth were perhaps as important as the physical benefits. In a world where winter meant months of darkness, cold, and the constant threat of death, the comfort of human contact provided emotional warmth that was almost as vital as the physical heat. These sleeping arrangements reinforced family bonds and community connections in ways that modern people with our heated homes and private bedrooms might find difficult to understand. Some farming communities developed visiting arrangements where families with fewer members could join larger households during the coldest months, creating temporary extended families united by the common goal of not freezing to death. These arrangements required careful negotiation about resources, space allocation, and social dynamics, but they often meant the difference between survival and tragedy for smaller families who lacked sufficient human heat sources. Managing fire in a barn filled with dry straw, wooden beams, and nervous animals was like performing surgery with dynamite absolutely necessary for survival, but one wrong move could turn your winter shelter into a spectacular funeral pyre. Medieval farmers faced an impossible choice: freeze to death in safety or risk burning alive while staying warm. Most chose the fire, but they developed safety protocols that would make modern fire marshals both impressed and terrified. The primary heating source was usually a carefully contained fire pit or primitive brazier, positioned with the precision of a military operation. Too close to the straw and you'd wake up in a blazing inferno. Too far from the sleeping area and the heat wouldn't reach the people who needed it most. Medieval farmers learned to calculate distances that provided maximum warmth, while minimizing the risk of accidental ignition, a skill that was literally passed down from generation to generation, because families who got it wrong didn't survive to pass down anything. Fire containment required constant vigilance and ingenious engineering solutions. Some farmers dug shallow pits lined with stones, creating primitive fireplaces that contained flames below ground level. Others built elevated stone platforms that kept fires away from flammable floor materials while allowing heat to radiate upward. The most sophisticated barn fire systems included crude chimneys or smoke holes that vented dangerous gases while retaining as much heat as possible within the structure. Water was always present but never abundant. Medieval farmers kept buckets of water, or in winter containers of snow strategically positioned around any fire source. But this wasn't just about emergency firefighting. In a barn environment, even small water containers served multiple purposes. They could dampen sparks, provide humidity to prevent the air from becoming dangerously dry, and create steam that could carry heat more effectively throughout the sleeping area. The fuel selection process was critical to barn fire safety. Dry-seasoned wood burned cleanly with minimal sparking, but it was often too valuable to waste on overnight heating. Green wood produced more smoke and was less likely to throw dangerous sparks, but it also generated less heat. Medieval farmers often used combinations of materials: dried dung for steady low-temperature burning, small amounts of wood for quick heat, and sometimes even controlled burns of agricultural waste that would otherwise attract pests. Spark control became an obsession for families sleeping in fire-heated barns. Metal screens made from whatever iron materials could be scavenged were positioned around fire sources to catch flying embers. Some farmers developed primitive spark arresters using woven grass or reed materials that could trap sparks while allowing heat to pass through. The most paranoid and often the most successful families assigned fire watch duties, with someone staying awake throughout the night to monitor flames and watch for signs of spreading fire. Historians still argue whether medieval barn fires were more often caused by human error or structural failures, but contemporary accounts suggest that most families experienced at least one fire scare during each winter season. The difference between a scare and a catastrophe often came down to preparation and quick response. Families drilled escape procedures, designated who would rescue which animals, and established protocols for salvaging essential supplies if evacuation became necessary. The psychological toll of sleeping next to open flames in a tinderbox environment can't be understated. Medieval accounts describe the constant background anxiety of parents who lay awake listening for the subtle sounds that might indicate fire was spreading beyond its containment. Children were taught from early age to sleep lightly and respond instantly to fire alarms, creating generations of people who could wake up and evacuate in seconds if necessary. Some of the most innovative medieval farmers developed early warning systems that could detect fires before they became catastrophic. Arrangements of thin metal pieces that would clatter when heated by nearby flames, primitive smoke detection using strategically placed materials that would change color when exposed to dangerous temperatures, and even trained animals whose behavior could signal fire danger before humans detected it. The irony wasn't lost on medieval farmers that their survival strategy required them to bring the very element that could destroy them into their most vulnerable space. But winter cold was a more immediate and certain killer than fire risk, so they chose the devil they could manage over the devil that would definitely kill them. Through careful engineering, constant vigilance, and more than a little luck, most families made it through winter with both their lives and their barns intact. Medieval farmers didn't just get dressed for winter, they became walking textile fortresses wearing every piece of clothing they owned in carefully engineered layers that could mean the difference between surviving the night and becoming a cautionary tale for next season's survivors. The goal wasn't fashion, it was creating a personal heating system that could function in environments where your breath froze before it left your mouth. The base layer started with whatever linen undergarments the family could afford, which for most farming families meant rough, scratchy fabric that felt like sleeping in a burlap sack. But this uncomfortable base layer served a crucial purpose. It wicked moisture away from the skin, preventing the deadly combination of sweat and cold that could lead to hypothermia faster than you could say medieval medicine. Over this went the first wool layer, usually a tunic or shift that provided the primary insulation barrier. Then came the strategic layering that separated survival experts from frozen corpses. Medieval farmers understood that trapped air was their best insulator, so they wore loose-fitting garments that created pockets of body-warmed air between layers. A second wool tunic, maybe a vest or jerkin, if the family was prosperous enough to own such luxuries, and then cloaks, shawls, and whatever other outer garments could be piled on without completely immobilizing the wearer. Leg protection was equally elaborate. Wool stockings or leg wrappings covered the lower legs, often extending up to the thighs. Over these went whatever pants, breeches, or leg coverings the family possessed. Some farmers even wrapped their legs in strips of wool or linen, creating primitive long underwear that added additional insulation layers. The most prepared individuals wore 2 or even 3 pairs of everything, turning their legs into insulated columns that could function in sub-freezing temperatures. Foot warmth was literally a matter of life and death. Frostbitten toes could become infected and kill you just as effectively as any sword wound. Medieval farmers wore multiple pairs of socks made from wool linen, or whatever materials they could gather. Over these went leather boots or wooden shoes stuffed with straw-dried grass or cloth scraps. Some farmers even wrapped their feet in additional cloth before putting on their outer footwear, creating primitive boot liners that trapped warm air around their feet. Hand protection involved similar layering strategies, but with the added challenge that farmers still needed to perform delicate tasks even in freezing conditions. Thin linen gloves provided the base layer, allowing for some dexterity. Over these went wool mittens or heavier gloves. Some farmers created removable outer mittens that could be quickly stripped off when fine motor control was needed, then rapidly replaced before their hands could freeze. Head and neck coverage wasn't optional. Medieval farmers understood that massive amounts of body heat escaped through the head and neck area. Wool caps, hoods, scarves, and head wrappings were layered together to create insulation systems that covered everything except the eyes and mouth. Some farmers even slept with cloth wrapped around their faces, creating primitive breathing filters that warmed incoming air before it reached their lungs. The engineering challenge of layered clothing systems was maintaining mobility while maximizing insulation. Too many layers and farmers couldn't move well enough to perform essential tasks like feeding animals or tending fires. Too few layers and they'd freeze to death before morning. Medieval farming families developed personal clothing strategies based on individual body types, heat generation, and specific responsibilities within the family survival system. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers found these elaborate clothing systems comfortable or merely tolerable, but contemporary accounts suggest that people developed techniques for adjusting their layers throughout the day and night, based on activity levels and temperature changes. Removing a cloak when working near the fire, adding an extra tunic when venturing outside, loosening layers when body heat built up from physical activity. These adjustments required constant attention and skill. The maintenance of layered clothing systems added significant work to medieval farming life. Wool garments had to be kept clean enough to function properly, but not so clean that valuable oils were stripped away. Layers had to be rotated so that inner garments could dry out from accumulated body moisture. Repairs where constant tears-worn spots and damage from daily use had to be fixed immediately, because a single hole in the insulation system could compromise the entire thermal protection strategy. Medieval farmers waged a constant war against drafts, treating every gap, crack, and opening in their barns like enemy infiltration points that could smuggle in enough cold air to kill. This wasn't paranoia, it was hard-earned wisdom from families who had learned that a single unsealed crack could create a wind tunnel that would steal precious heat and leave everyone shivering until dawn. Draft warfare required both engineering skills and the kind of obsessive attention to detail that would make modern weatherproofing contractors weep with admiration. The enemy was everywhere and relentlessly persistent. Wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes, creating gaps that appeared overnight. Barn walls settled over time, opening new cracks that hadn't existed the previous winter. Even the most carefully constructed buildings developed vulnerabilities as timber's age foundations shifted, and the constant freeze-thaw cycle worked its destructive magic on every joint and seam. Medieval farmers developed a sophisticated arsenal of draft-sealing materials that would have impressed modern insulation specialists. Moss was the gold standard. It could be packed into gaps, would expand when moistened, and provided excellent insulating properties. Dried grass and straw could fill larger openings, while cloth scraps and rags worked for medium-sized gaps. For the smallest cracks, farmers used mixtures of mud, animal dung, and chopped straw that could be pressed into openings and would harden into surprisingly effective seals. The most ingenious farmers created portable draft blockers that could be repositioned as needed. Cloth tubes stuffed with straw or dried grass could be placed against door frames, window openings, or floor-level gaps where cold air typically infiltrated. Some families made primitive draft curtains from old blankets or cloaks that could be hung across areas where structural sealing wasn't possible. These weren't permanent solutions, but they could be deployed quickly when temperature drops threatened family survival. Animal fur and hide scraps became valuable weatherproofing materials. Sheepskins could cover larger openings, while smaller fur pieces could be stuffed into gaps where other materials wouldn't fit properly. The natural oils in animal fur provided water resistance that helped prevent moisture infiltration, which was almost as dangerous as cold air infiltration since wet insulation lost most of its thermal protection properties. Some medieval farmers developed early detection systems for identifying new draft sources before they became life-threatening problems. Candle flames could reveal air currents that weren't immediately obvious to human senses. Smoke from fires would show circulation patterns that indicated where cold air was entering and warm air was escaping. The most experienced farmers could literally feel draft patterns with their hands, identifying problem areas that needed immediate attention. The psychology of draft warfare was almost as important as the physical techniques. Medieval farming families understood that constant vigilance was required. What worked yesterday might not work today if weather conditions had changed overnight. Children were taught to recognize the signs of dangerous drafts and to alert adults immediately when they detected new cold infiltration. This wasn't just helpful, it was essential family survival training. Seasonal maintenance of draft defences required careful planning and resource management. Materials used for sealing had to be replenished throughout the winter as they wore out, compressed, or were damaged by moisture. Some farmers developed stockpiling strategies, gathering extra moss grass and cloth during autumn, so they would have supplies available when emergency repairs were needed during the coldest months. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers understood the scientific principles behind air circulation and heat loss, but their practical knowledge was remarkably sophisticated. They knew that warm air rose and would escape through high openings if not properly sealed. They understood that cold air flowed like water seeking the lowest entry points and pooling in floor-level areas. Their draft fighting techniques demonstrated practical physics knowledge that rivaled formal engineering training. The most successful farming families developed systematic approaches to draft inspection and repair. Daily routines included checking known problem areas, feeling for new air infiltration points, and making immediate temporary repairs that could be improved when time and materials allowed. These families understood that draft warfare wasn't a single battle, but a continuous campaign that lasted the entire winter season. Emergency draft response protocols were essential for survival during severe weather events. When sudden temperature drops or windstorms threatened to overwhelm existing defenses, families needed to be able to quickly deploy additional sealing materials and techniques. The difference between families who survived extreme weather and those who didn't often came down to how quickly they could respond to catastrophic draft infiltration that could steal life-sustaining heat in a matter of hours. Medieval farmers discovered that one of their most powerful weapons against freezing to death was surprisingly simple stuff yourself, with the heaviest, densest food you could find right before crawling into your straw fortress for the night. This wasn't about comfort eating or late-night snacking, it was strategic fuel loading that turned your digestive system into a personal heating furnace that could generate internal warmth for hours while you slept. The science behind this survival strategy was elegantly simple, even if medieval farmers didn't understand the biochemistry involved. Digesting food requires energy, and energy production generates heat as a byproduct. The more work your digestive system had to do, the more internal heat it produced. This meant that a heavy meal before bedtime could literally keep you alive through a night that might otherwise freeze you solid in your sleep. But not all foods were equal in the medieval heating game. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and onions were winter survival superstars because they were dense, fibrous, and required significant digestive energy to break down. These weren't gourmet meals, they were fuel loads designed to keep your internal fires burning through the darkest hours. A thick stew made from root vegetables, whatever grain could be spared, and any available protein became the medieval equivalent of rocket fuel for human heating systems. Grains were another cornerstone of bedtime heat generation. Oat porridge, barley gruel, and dense rye bread provided complex carbohydrates that burned slowly throughout the night, creating sustained heat production rather than brief warming spurts. Medieval farmers learned to time their grain consumption so that the digestive process would peak during the coldest pre-dawn hours when body temperatures naturally drop to their most dangerous levels. Fat was the ultimate thermal fuel when it was available. A piece of salted pork, a chunk of cheese, or even a spoonful of animal fat added to evening stew could provide concentrated calories that generated intensive heat production. Medieval farmers understood that fat contained more than twice the energy density of other foods, making it precious cargo for winter survival. Families hoarded fat like modern people, stockpile batteries knowing that a small amount could mean the difference between surviving a brutal night and waking up dead. The timing of these survival meals required careful calculation. Eat too early, and the heat generation would peak before the coldest part of the night. Eat too late, and you might not be able to fall asleep while your digestive system was working overtime. Medieval families developed personal timing strategies based on observation and experience learning to coordinate their eating schedules with temperature patterns and sleeping arrangements. Liquid consumption played an equally important role in medieval thermal management. Hot beverages weren't just comforting, they provided immediate internal warming, while adding fluid calories that could extend heat production. Warm ale heated water mixed with honey or herbal teas made from whatever plants could be gathered provided both immediate comfort and ongoing thermal benefits. Some farmers even developed techniques for keeping beverages warm throughout the night, using heated stones or carefully managed coals to maintain drinking temperature. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers understood the connection between specific foods and heat generation, but their food choices clearly demonstrated practical knowledge that was remarkably sophisticated. They consistently chose foods that modern nutritionists would recognize as optimal for sustained energy production and thermal regulation. Their survival meals weren't random. They were carefully engineered fuel systems designed to maximize internal heat production. The social aspects of bedtime eating added another layer to medieval survival strategy. Sharing heavy meals before sleep reinforced family bonds while ensuring that everyone received adequate fuel for heat generation. Children, elderly family members, and anyone who was ill received priority portions of the most thermally effective foods. This wasn't just kindness, it was practical resource allocation that improved survival odds for the entire family unit. Food preparation for thermal effectiveness required specific techniques that differed from normal cooking methods. Longer cooking times broke down fibrous materials, making them easier to digest and more thermally efficient. Adding spices when available didn't just improve flavor, many spices stimulated circulation and enhanced the warming effects of food. Medieval farmers learned to cook survival meals in ways that maximized their heat-generating potential, rather than focusing primarily on taste or appearance. Medieval farming families discovered that winter survival required abandoning the luxury of uninterrupted sleep. Instead, they developed watch systems that would have impressed military strategists with family members taking turns staying awake throughout the night to tend fires, monitor animals, and watch for the deadly signs that could turn a cold night into a family tragedy. Sleep became a shared responsibility, where everyone's survival depended on someone staying alert while others rested. The fire watch was the most critical night duty, because letting flames die during the coldest hours could mean waking up to frozen livestock and hypothermic family members. The designated fire tender didn't just add fuel occasionally, they became intimate students of flame behavior, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when fires needed attention. A slight change in flame color could signal that fuel moisture content was changing. The sound of crackling could indicate whether flames were burning efficiently or struggling with damp materials. Experienced fire watchers developed almost supernatural abilities to judge fuel consumption rates and plan additions hours in advance. They learned to bank coals during warm periods and intensify flames when temperatures dropped. Some families created elaborate fuel preparation systems where the night watcher could add pre-measured amounts of combustible material without fully waking sleeping family members. This required precise knowledge of how different materials burned and how much heat they would generate. Animal monitoring was equally crucial during overnight watches. Livestock could indicate weather changes hours before humans detected them, but someone had to be awake to read these signals. Restless cattle often meant incoming storms. Huddled sheep could indicate temperature drops that human senses hadn't yet registered. Chickens roosting in unusual positions might signal wind direction changes that could affect barn ventilation and heating efficiency. The night watch also served as an early warning system for medical emergencies that could develop quickly in freezing conditions. Hypothermia symptoms could progress rapidly, especially in children and elderly family members. Someone staying awake could detect the subtle signs, changes in breathing patterns, restless movement that might indicate dangerous cooling, or unusual stillness that could signal developing frostbite. Early intervention often meant the difference between minor cold injuries and life-threatening medical crises. Medieval families developed sophisticated rotation systems that balanced individual sleep needs with collective survival requirements. Adults typically took longer watches than children, but even young family members were assigned shorter observation duties that contributed to overall safety. These rotations considered individual heat generation alertness patterns and specific skills. Some people were naturally better at reading animal behavior, while others excelled at fire management or weather prediction. Historians still argue whether medieval farming families found night watch duties burdensome or reassuring, but contemporary accounts suggest that many people developed preferences for specific watch times. Some individuals naturally stayed alert during early evening hours, while others functioned better during pre-dawn periods. Families learned to match watch assignments with individual biological rhythms, creating more effective surveillance systems that took advantage of natural alertness patterns. Communication during night watches required techniques that could convey important information without waking sleeping family members unnecessarily. Gentle touch signals, whispered code words, and subtle movements became the language of midnight survival. Watchkeepers learned to distinguish between situations that required immediate family response and problems they could handle independently, preventing unnecessary sleep disruption while ensuring adequate response to genuine emergencies. The psychological aspects of night watch duty included both reassurance and anxiety. Having someone awake provided comfort for sleeping family members who knew that threats were being monitored, but watchkeepers often experienced the stress of bearing responsibility for everyone's survival during the most vulnerable hours. Some families developed rituals or activities that helped night watchers stay alert and calm. Quiet prayers, mental exercises, or carefully planned tasks that maintained vigilance without creating anxiety. Emergency protocols were essential for night watch effectiveness. Watchkeepers needed to know exactly what to do if fires got out of control, if animals showed signs of distress, if family members displayed symptoms of cold injury, or if weather conditions deteriorated beyond safe levels. These weren't written procedures, they were survival knowledge passed down through generations and practiced until responses became automatic, because during genuine emergencies there was no time for hesitation or consultation. Medieval farmers learned that surviving winter wasn't just about staying warm on the outside. It was about protecting their lungs from air so cold it could literally freeze the moisture in their respiratory system and cause internal injuries that could kill them just as effectively as any battlefield wound. Breathing became a carefully managed survival skill that required constant attention and techniques that would seem almost meditative if they weren't absolutely necessary for staying alive. The basic principle was counterintuitive to modern people, who are used to taking deep, refreshing breaths of fresh air. In sub-freezing conditions, large volumes of extremely cold air could shock the respiratory system, trigger violent coughing fits, and cause internal damage that could develop into fatal pneumonia within days. Medieval farmers developed breathing techniques that minimized air volume while maximizing warming efficiency, turning every breath into a carefully calculated survival decision. Nose breathing became the gold standard of medieval winter survival because the nasal passages provided natural air warming and humidification that mouth breathing couldn't match. Air passing through the nose was pre-warmed by body heat and moistened by natural secretions before reaching the lungs. This wasn't just more comfortable, it was medically safer in conditions where unfiltered cold air could cause respiratory trauma that medieval medicine had no ability to treat effectively. The technique of shallow, controlled breathing required practice and discipline that families taught like any other essential survival skill. Children learn to breathe in small sips rather than deep gulps, allowing each intake of air to be warmed by their body heat before the next breath brought in more cold air. This breathing pattern felt unnatural at first, but families who mastered it had significantly lower rates of respiratory illness during harsh winter months. Cloth breathing filters became essential equipment for anyone who had to venture outside or work in the coldest areas of barns. Scarves, pieces of wool, or specially prepared cloth strips could be wrapped around the nose and mouth, creating primitive air warming systems that used body heat and breath moisture to pre-warm incoming air. These weren't just comfort measures, they were medical devices that could prevent lung damage in extreme conditions. Some medieval farmers developed sophisticated cloth preparation techniques for breathing filters. Wool treated with animal fat created water-resistant barriers that maintained insulating properties even when they became damp from breath moisture. Multiple layers of different fabrics could create warming chambers where air was progressively heated as it passed through various materials. The most prepared families created sets of breathing filters that could be rotated as they became saturated with moisture. Sleep breathing presented unique challenges because unconscious breathing patterns couldn't be consciously controlled. Medieval families learned to position sleeping arrangements so that shared body heat would warm the air around sleeping faces before it was inhaled. Some families even created primitive tent structures using cloaks or blankets suspended over sleeping areas, trapping warmed air and preventing the coldest ambient air from reaching sleepers' respiratory systems. The danger signs of respiratory cold injury were well known to medieval farming communities, even if they didn't understand the medical mechanisms involved. Persistent coughing that produced blood chest pain that worsened with breathing, or breathing difficulties that developed after cold exposure were recognized as potentially fatal conditions that required immediate warming and protection from further cold air exposure. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers understood the scientific principles behind respiratory warming, but their practical techniques demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of how cold air affected human physiology. They consistently developed methods that modern medical professionals would recognize as effective for preventing cold-induced respiratory trauma, suggesting that this knowledge was gained through generations of careful observation and tragic trial and error. Emergency breathing techniques were essential for situations where normal protective measures failed. If someone had to work in extremely cold conditions or emergency situations exposed them to dangerous air temperatures, families knew how to provide immediate respiratory protection. Skin-to-skin contact around the face area, shared breathing under blankets, and rapid warming techniques could prevent respiratory trauma that might otherwise prove fatal. The psychological aspects of controlled breathing included both anxiety and reassurance. Learning to breathe carefully required constant attention that could increase stress levels, but mastering these techniques provided confidence that families could survive extreme conditions. Children who learned proper winter breathing often developed lifelong habits that served them well during subsequent harsh seasons, creating generational survival knowledge that improved family odds of winter survival. When medieval farmers spotted the telltale signs of frostbite or hypothermia developing in family members, they faced medical emergencies that could progress from minor cold injury to life-threatening crisis in a matter of hours. Without doctors, hospitals, or any modern medical intervention, farming families had to become their own emergency response teams, armed with nothing but traditional knowledge and whatever warming materials they could gather quickly enough to save a life. The early warning signs were burned into every medieval farmer's memory, because recognizing them early often meant the difference between successful treatment and tragic loss. Frostbite typically announced itself with skin that became waxy white or greyish-yellow areas that felt unusually firm or hard to the touch, and skin that no longer responded to pressure or warmth. Hypothermia presented more subtly, confusion, slurred speech, drowsiness that seemed inappropriate for the time of day, or shivering that suddenly stopped despite continued cold exposure. The immediate response protocol was counterintuitive, but absolutely critical gradual warming rather than rapid heating. Medieval farmers had learned through bitter experience that plunging frostbitten extremities into hot water or placing them directly against fires could cause more tissue damage than the original cold injury. Instead, they developed slow warming techniques that gave damaged tissues time to recover circulation without causing additional trauma. Skin-to-skin contact became the primary emergency warming method for treating hypothermia. Family members would strip to their undergarments and hold the affected person against their warm bodies, sharing vital heat directly through physical contact. This wasn't modest or comfortable, but it was effective human body heat provided controlled, gentle warming that could gradually raise core temperatures without shocking the system. Multiple family members might take turns providing body heat to prevent the rescuers from becoming hypothermic themselves. For frostbitten extremities, medieval farmers used warm, not hot water soaks when water could be heated gradually. The affected area would be immersed in water that felt barely warm to healthy skin, allowing circulation to return slowly to damaged tissues. Some families added salt to warming water, believing it helped with circulation, though historians still argue whether this practice was medically beneficial or simply traditional ritual that provided psychological comfort. Alcohol played a controversial role in medieval cold injury treatment. Some families believed that drinks of warm ale or other alcoholic beverages could help restore circulation and provide internal warming. Others had observed that alcohol seemed to make cold injuries worse, though they didn't understand that alcohol actually increases heat loss by dilating blood vessels near the skin surface. The most experienced farming families generally avoided alcohol during cold emergencies, relying instead on warm, non-alcoholic beverages for internal heating. Protective wrapping techniques were crucial for preventing further injury to damaged tissues. Soft wool or linen cloths were wrapped loosely around frostbitten areas to provide insulation without restricting circulation that was trying to return to damaged tissues. These wrappings had to be checked frequently and adjusted as swelling developed or circulation patterns changed. Too tight, and the wrappings could cut off blood flow. Too loose, and they provided inadequate protection. Medieval families developed communication strategies for managing cold injury emergencies because affected individuals often couldn't make rational decisions for themselves. Hypothermia caused confusion and poor judgment that made patients unreliable reporters of their own condition. Family members learned to ignore protests from affected individuals who insisted they felt fine while displaying obvious symptoms of dangerous cooling. The recovery monitoring process required constant vigilance because cold injuries could worsen even after initial warming treatments began. Families watch for signs of returning circulation, skin color changes, restoration of sensation or renewed pain as feeling returned to damaged areas. They also monitored for dangerous complications like infection in frostbitten tissues or signs that internal body temperature wasn't stabilizing despite warming efforts. Historians still argue whether medieval cold injury treatments were medically sound, but many of their techniques align surprisingly well with modern emergency medicine protocols. Their emphasis on gradual warming, avoiding alcohol, using body heat for hypothermia treatment, and protecting damaged tissues from further injury demonstrates practical medical knowledge that was remarkably sophisticated for people without formal medical training. Prevention strategies evolved from families' emergency treatment experiences. Those who had successfully treated cold injuries became community experts who shared knowledge about recognizing early warning signs, maintaining better protective measures, and implementing warming techniques before conditions became life-threatening. This knowledge transfer helped entire farming communities improve their survival rates during severe winter conditions. Medieval farming families understood that children were both the most precious cargo and the most vulnerable passengers on winter's deadly voyage. Kids generated less body heat than adults, couldn't make rational survival decisions under stress, and had smaller energy reserves to sustain them through brutal nights. Protecting children from freezing to death required family strategies that were part military operation, part nursing care, and part around-the-clock vigilance that could exhaust adult caregivers by spring. The thermal hierarchy in medieval barn sleeping arrangements always put children at the centre of the warmest zones, surrounded by adults whose larger bodies could generate and share heat more effectively. This wasn't sentimentality, it was practical resource allocation that recognised children as the family's future and therefore worth the investment of premium thermal real estate. Parents willingly took the colder outer positions, acting as human windbreaks, while ensuring their children occupied the heat-generating core of family sleeping arrangements. Clothing strategies for children involved even more elaborate layering than adult systems, because kids couldn't generate enough internal heat to compensate for inadequate insulation. Medieval children often wore adult-sized garments stuffed with straw or cloth to create oversized warming chambers that trapped body heat in air pockets around their smaller frames. They looked like tiny walking haystacks, but they stayed alive while less protected children in neighbouring families might not survive severe cold snaps. Feeding priorities during winter clearly favoured children who received the most calorie-dense foods available to fuel their internal heating systems. Fat, when available, was allocated to children first. Dense grains and root vegetables that provided sustained energy for heat generation were prioritised for young family members. Some families even developed feeding schedules that ensured children consumed warming foods at optimal times to maintain heat production through the coldest overnight hours. Sleep positioning for children required constant adjustment and monitoring because kids moved more during sleep and could inadvertently expose themselves to dangerous cold. Parents developed techniques for loosely restraining children's movement without restricting circulation using soft cloth ties or sleeping bag arrangements that kept kids positioned in the warmest zones while allowing some movement for comfort. These weren't restraints in a harsh sense, they were safety measures that prevented children from rolling into potentially fatal cold pockets. Medieval parents became expert at reading the subtle signs that indicated children were developing cold-related problems, changes in skin colour, unusual restlessness or stillness, breathing patterns that differed from normal sleep or crying, that had a different quality could all signal developing hypothermia or other cold injuries. Parents learned to check children throughout the night using gentle touch to assess body temperature and circulation without fully waking sleeping kids. The psychological aspects of protecting children included managing their fear and anxiety about winter conditions while teaching essential survival skills. Children needed to understand winter dangers without becoming paralyzed by terror, and they needed to learn protective behaviors without losing the natural resilience that helped them adapt to harsh conditions. Medieval parents developed storytelling and game techniques that taught survival skills through engaging activities rather than frightening lectures. Some families created special warming techniques specifically designed for children who were too small to benefit from adult-oriented heat generation strategies. Heated stones wrapped in cloth could provide localized warming for children's sleeping areas. Warm beverages prepared specifically for children's smaller stomachs and tolerance levels could provide internal heating without overwhelming their digestive systems. Small animals like cats or small dogs were sometimes assigned as personal heating companions for children. Educational priorities for children during winter included teaching them to recognize their own cold injury symptoms and communicate their needs effectively to adults. Kids learned to identify when they couldn't feel their fingers or toes, when they felt confused or unusually sleepy, or when breathing became difficult. This wasn't just helpful, it was essential, because children experiencing early hypothermia might not realize they were in danger until the condition became life-threatening. Historians still argue whether medieval childhood survival rates were significantly better in families that implemented systematic child protection strategies, but contemporary accounts suggest that communities with strong child-focused winter survival traditions had measurably better outcomes. Families that treated child protection as a specialized skill requiring specific techniques and resources consistently had more children survive to adulthood than those that simply hoped kids would adapt to harsh conditions without additional support. The long-term development of children who survived medieval winters using these protection strategies often resulted in adults who had superior cold tolerance and survival skills. Kids who learned comprehensive winter survival techniques from early childhood became the most effective winter survival experts in their adult years, creating generational knowledge transfer that improved entire family lines' ability to survive harsh seasonal conditions. Medieval farmers discovered that their livestock weren't just sources of warmth and food. They were living barometers, weather stations, and early warning systems that could predict dangerous conditions, hours or even days before human senses detected the approaching threats. Learning to read animal behavior became a survival skill as essential as fire building or food preservation, because animals possessed sensory abilities and instincts that could spell the difference between being prepared for a deadly storm and being caught fatally unprepared. Cattle behavior provided some of the most reliable weather prediction available to medieval farmers. When cows huddled together more tightly than usual, experienced farmers knew that temperatures were about to drop significantly. When cattle sought shelter, even when conditions seemed mild to human perception, a severe storm was often approaching within hours. Cows grazing frantically as if trying to consume as much food as possible before some anticipated event typically indicated that the animals sensed weather changes that would make feeding difficult or impossible. Horses demonstrated even more sophisticated weather-sensing abilities that medieval farmers learned to interpret with scientific precision. Restless horses that couldn't settle into normal rest patterns often meant that barometric pressure was dropping rapidly, indicating incoming storm systems. Horses that refused to venture far from shelter, even when encouraged by their handlers, had detected atmospheric conditions that humans couldn't sense, but that predicted dangerous weather within the next day or two. Pigs provided unique weather intelligence because of their sensitive hearing and their ability to detect ground vibrations that preceded major weather events. Swine that became agitated without obvious cause often sensed the approach of severe thunderstorms or wind systems that could bring dangerous temperature drops. Medieval farmers learned that pig behavior changes typically preceded weather events by 12 to 24 hours, providing valuable preparation time for families who knew how to read these signals. Sheep offered perhaps the most accurate short-term weather prediction because of their exceptional sensitivity to humidity and air pressure changes. Flocks that gathered into tight clusters, when conditions seemed perfectly normal to humans, were responding to atmospheric pressure drops that indicated weather changes within hours. Sheep that sought higher ground or specific shelter orientations were positioning themselves based on wind pattern changes that human senses couldn't detect. Chickens and other poultry provided immediate weather warnings that could save lives during rapidly developing dangerous conditions. Fowl that refused to leave their roosting areas during normal activity times often sensed atmospheric conditions that preceded sudden temperature drops or severe wind events. Chickens that gathered in unusual formations or sought shelter in locations they typically avoided were responding to environmental cues that indicated immediate weather threats. Medieval farmers developed sophisticated animal observation techniques that modern meteorologists would recognize as legitimate atmospheric monitoring methods. They learned to distinguish between normal animal behavior variations and the specific patterns that indicated weather-related concerns. Experienced farmers could predict weather conditions with accuracy that rivaled modern forecasting by carefully observing multiple animal species and correlating their behaviors with atmospheric changes. The timing of animal weather predictions allowed medieval families to implement survival preparations that could prevent tragedy during severe conditions. 24 hours advance warning meant time to gather extra fuel, secure additional food supplies, reinforce barn structures, and position family members for optimal survival during extended harsh weather. Even 6-hour advance warnings could provide sufficient time to implement emergency heating and protection measures. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers understood the scientific principles behind animal weather sensing, but their practical application of these observations was remarkably sophisticated. They consistently acted on animal behavioral cues that modern science recognizes as legitimate responses to barometric pressure, electromagnetic changes, and other atmospheric conditions that precede significant weather events. Some farming communities developed elaborate animal behavior monitoring systems where different families specialized in observing specific animal types and sharing weather intelligence throughout the community. These informal networks created early warning systems that helped entire villages prepare for dangerous weather conditions, improving survival rates for families who might not have had sufficient animals to provide comprehensive weather monitoring on their own. Emergency response protocols based on animal behavior warnings became standardized within medieval farming communities. Specific animal behavior patterns triggered predetermined family and community responses, gathering fuel, securing livestock, preparing emergency food supplies, and implementing enhanced heating and protection measures. These weren't superstitious practices. They were empirically based survival strategies that leveraged animal sensory abilities that humans couldn't match. When winter's grip became too deadly for individual families to survive alone, medieval farming communities transformed their scattered barns into interconnected survival networks that could mean the difference between entire families living or dying. These weren't formal arrangements with written contracts. They were desperate alliances forged by the understanding that sharing resources and shelter might save everyone while stubbornly trying to survive independently could doom entire bloodlines to frozen graves. The decision to open family barns to neighbors wasn't made lightly because every additional person meant dividing already scarce resources among more mouths and bodies. But medieval farmers had learned through bitter experience that certain survival tasks were nearly impossible for small families to manage alone. Maintaining adequate firewatch coverage, monitoring livestock health, managing complex heating systems and responding to emergencies required more human resources than nuclear families could provide during the most dangerous winter conditions. Community barn networks typically formed around practical considerations rather than social relationships. Families with larger, better constructed barns often became hub locations that could accommodate multiple families during extreme weather. The hub barns weren't necessarily owned by the wealthiest families, they were simply the structures best suited for supporting larger groups of people and animals during survival situations. Location mattered too. Barns positioned to provide mutual support and communication had strategic advantages during extended harsh weather. Resource sharing within community barn networks required careful negotiation and established protocols that prevented conflicts during high-stress survival situations. Families contributed to shared resources based on their available supplies. Some brought extra fuel, others provided additional food stores, others contributed specialized knowledge or skills. These weren't equal partnerships. They were pragmatic arrangements where everyone contributed what they could in exchange for collective survival advantages. The logistics of housing multiple families in shared barn spaces required engineering solutions that maximized warmth, while maintaining some level of social order. Sleeping arrangements had to accommodate family groups while creating efficient heat-sharing configurations. Fire management became more complex when multiple families needed access to heating sources. Privacy became nearly impossible, but survival took priority over personal comfort or social conventions. Communication systems between networked barns allowed farming communities to coordinate responses to severe weather events and share critical information about dangerous conditions. Signal systems using smoke bells or arranged light patterns could convey messages between barns that were within sight of each other. Some communities developed messenger systems where individuals could travel between barns during less severe conditions to share weather intelligence and coordinate resource distribution. Historians still argue whether community barn networks were primarily survival strategies or social institutions, but contemporary accounts suggest that these arrangements often determined which families survived particularly brutal winters. Communities that effectively implemented mutual aid barn networks had measurably better survival rates than isolated families who attempted to survive independently during extreme conditions. Leadership within community barn networks often emerged organically based on experience, knowledge, and practical skills, rather than formal social hierarchies. Families with superior winter survival experience might take coordinating roles, while individuals with specific expertise in areas like animal care, fire management, or weather prediction could become specialized leaders for their particular skill areas. These leadership arrangements were typically temporary and focused solely on survival effectiveness. The psychological benefits of community barn networks included reduced isolation and shared responsibility that could prevent the despair and poor decision-making that often accompanied extreme survival situations. Knowing that other families were facing similar challenges and that mutual support was available could provide hope and resilience that individual families might not be able to maintain during extended harsh conditions. Emergency protocols for community barn networks required predetermined plans for responding to catastrophic events that could threaten multiple families simultaneously. Fire emergencies, structural failures, medical crises, or severe weather events that exceeded normal survival preparations needed coordinated responses that could save lives across the entire network. These plans weren't written documents. They were survival knowledge that was shared and practiced within communities. Some community barn networks developed specialized roles and responsibilities that improved overall survival effectiveness. Certain individuals might become designated weather watchers, fire specialists, or medical responders who could provide expertise that benefited the entire group. Children from different families might be assigned to specific adults who could provide enhanced protection during dangerous conditions, creating temporary family structures optimized for survival rather than biological relationships. The most dangerous moment of any medieval winter night wasn't when temperatures reached their lowest point. It was the morning after, when families faced the delicate process of reviving themselves and their animals from states that bordered perilously close to death. Morning survival rituals weren't about comfort or convenience. They were medical procedures that determined whether everyone who had gone to sleep the night before would actually wake up functional, or whether some family members might have sustained cold injuries that could prove fatal without immediate intervention. The first challenge was simply determining who was alive and uninjured after a brutal night. Medieval families developed gentle wake-up techniques that could assess family members' conditions without causing shock that might worsen hypothermia or other cold injuries. Soft touches to check for normal body temperature, gentle voice calls to test responsiveness, and careful observation of breathing patterns provided initial health assessments that guided the morning revival process. Assessing livestock health required equally careful evaluation, because animals that survived the night might still be suffering from cold injuries that could worsen rapidly without proper care. Cattle that seemed fine initially might have frostbitten udders or hooves that needed immediate attention. Horses could develop circulation problems that weren't immediately obvious, but could become life-threatening if not treated quickly. Chickens might appear normal, while actually suffering from respiratory damage caused by breathing extremely cold air. Fire revival was the most critical morning task because restoring heat sources determined whether the family could continue survival activities or would face another potentially fatal night without adequate warming capability. Banking techniques weren't foolproof. Sometimes morning revealed cold ashes, where life-sustaining embers should have been glowing. Medieval farmers developed emergency fire-starting techniques that could restore heating, even when banking had failed, using materials and methods that could create flames even in extremely cold conditions. Personal revival required systematic warming techniques that restored circulation and normal body function without causing injury to tissues that might have been damaged by cold exposure. Medieval families learned to warm extremities gradually, starting with core body areas and working outward to hands and feet. Sudden warming could cause circulation damage that was worse than the original cold injury. So morning revival became a carefully orchestrated process that took hours to complete safely. Food preparation during morning revival focused on providing internal heating that could restore normal body metabolism after a night of survival-level functioning. Warm liquids were prioritized because they could provide immediate internal warming, while being gentle enough for digestive systems that might be operating at reduced capacity. Hot porridge, warm ale, or heated water with honey provided calories and warmth that helped restart normal physiological processes. Movement and circulation restoration required gentle exercises that could encourage blood flow without overstressing bodies that had spent hours in survival mode. Medieval families developed stretching and movement routines that could be performed in confined barn spaces, helping family members regain normal circulation and muscle function after nights spent in cramped cold conditions. These weren't formal exercise programs, they were medical interventions disguised as morning activities. Animal care during morning revival included providing warmth, food, and water that helped livestock recover from night-long survival stress. Animals that had survived extreme cold often needed encouragement to eat and drink, because their systems might be operating at reduced capacity. Gentle warming techniques for animals included using heated stones, providing extra bedding, and offering warm water that could help restore normal body function. Assessment of overall family and livestock condition determined whether the family could continue normal winter survival activities or needed to implement emergency measures for members who hadn't fully recovered from the previous night's cold exposure. This assessment guided decisions about work assignments, resource allocation, and preparations for the coming night's survival challenges. Historians still argue whether medieval morning revival techniques were medically sound, but many of their practices align with modern treatment protocols for cold exposure and hypothermia recovery. Their emphasis on gradual warming, careful monitoring of circulation, gentle movement restoration, and systematic health assessment demonstrates sophisticated understanding of cold injury treatment and recovery processes. Preparation for the next night began immediately after morning revival was complete, because medieval farmers understood that survival was a continuous cycle rather than isolated events. Morning activities included gathering fuel, checking and repairing shelter systems, preparing food supplies, and positioning resources for optimal access during the coming night's survival activities. Each morning's survival success created the foundation for surviving the next night's challenges. Medieval farmers survived winter nights through a carefully curated arsenal of tools and implements that were literally the difference between life and death. These weren't sophisticated modern devices, they were simple, robust pieces of equipment that had been refined through generations of trial and error by people who understood that a broken tool in January could mean a frozen family by February. Every implement had to be reliable, repairable, and capable of functioning in conditions that would challenge even modern equipment. Fire-making tools were the crown jewels of medieval survival equipment, because without the ability to create and maintain flames, every other survival strategy became irrelevant. Flint and steel were precious possessions that families guarded like military weapons, because losing these fire-starting materials could doom the entire household. Medieval farmers often carried backup fire-starting materials, multiple pieces of flint steel implements that could serve double duty for other tasks, and carefully prepared tinder that would catch sparks even in damp conditions. Tinder preparation was an art form that required specific knowledge and seasonal planning. The best tinder materials were gathered during autumn when they could be properly dried and stored for winter use. Charred cloth, dried moss, shredded bark, and specially prepared fungal materials each had different ignition characteristics and burning properties. Medieval families created tinder kits that contained multiple options, because having the wrong tinder material for specific conditions could mean the difference between successful fire starting and deadly failure. Fuel preparation tools were equally critical, because the difference between efficient and inefficient fuel use could determine whether families had adequate heating materials to last through extended cold periods. Axes and hatchets had to be maintained in perfect condition, because dull cutting tools made fuel preparation dangerous and inefficient. Medieval farmers often owned multiple cutting implements of different sizes and weights, optimized for different fuel preparation tasks, and capable of functioning even when some tools became damaged. Water management tools were essential because access to unfrozen water often meant the difference between survival and dehydration during winter months. Medieval farmers used various implements to break ice, transport water, and store liquid supplies in conditions where water could freeze solid within hours. Metal tools for ice breaking had to be robust enough to function repeatedly without breaking, because losing water access during severe cold could be fatal within days. Food preparation implements had to function in conditions where normal cooking methods might be impossible due to fuel shortages or extreme cold. Medieval families owned specialized tools for preparing survival foods that required minimal cooking for accessing preserved food supplies that might be frozen solid, and for rationing limited food resources with precision that could extend supplies through longer than expected harsh periods. Repair tools were absolutely critical because equipment failure during winter survival situations often couldn't wait for spring to be addressed. Medieval farmers maintained toolkits that could repair barn structures, fix heating systems, mend clothing and bedding, and restore other survival equipment using materials that were available during winter months. These repair capabilities often determined whether families could maintain their survival systems through extended harsh weather. Clothing maintenance tools helped families keep their insulation systems functional throughout winter months when replacement materials weren't available. Needle thread patches and sewing implements allowed families to repair clothing damage that could compromise thermal protection. Medieval farmers often owned specialized tools for working with leather wool and other materials that were essential for maintaining winter clothing systems. Measuring and rationing tools helped families manage limited resources with the precision necessary for survival through uncertain winter durations. Simple measuring implements allowed families to portion food fuel and other survival supplies in ways that maximized resource longevity, while ensuring adequate daily consumption for survival. These tools weren't luxury items. They were essential equipment for resource management that could prevent starvation or hypothermia. Emergency tools provided backup capabilities for situations where primary survival systems failed catastrophically. Medieval families often maintained emergency tool caches that could provide alternative methods for creating fire-accessing food, maintaining shelter, or treating medical emergencies when their primary equipment failed or was lost. These backup systems often made the difference between recoverable setbacks and family disasters. Historians still argue whether medieval survival tools were as effective as their modern counterparts, but their simplicity and durability often provided advantages in extreme conditions where complex modern equipment might fail. Medieval tools were designed to function with minimal maintenance, using materials that were available for repairs and operated by people who understood their limitations and optimal use conditions. Tool maintenance became a critical winter activity because equipment failure during survival situations could have catastrophic consequences. Medieval families developed maintenance routines that kept their survival tools functional throughout winter months, using available materials and techniques that could restore tool performance without access to specialized repair facilities or replacement parts. Medieval farmers understood that winter survival began long before the first frost appeared. It started with autumn preparation cycles that determined whether families would thrive, barely survive, or perish during the coming cold months. These weren't casual getting-ready activities. They were life-or-death preparation campaigns that required strategic planning, back-breaking labor, and resource management skills that would impress modern disaster preparedness experts. Families that approached autumn preparation with military precision lived to see spring. Those who procrastinated often didn't. Fuel gathering dominated autumn activities because running out of combustible materials during winter was essentially a death sentence with a delayed execution date. Medieval farmers spent weeks collecting, cutting, and storing every burnable material they could find. Deadwood was premium fuel that burned cleanly and provided maximum heat output. Fallen branches had to be gathered before they became too wet or began rotting. Even dried dung was carefully collected and stored because in fuel-scarce environments, anything that would burn was precious survival material. Food preservation required timing and techniques that modern people with electric freezers can barely comprehend. Autumn harvests had to be processed immediately using methods that would keep food edible through months of storage without refrigeration. Vegetables were dried, pickled, or stored in root cellars that maintained temperatures cold enough to prevent spoilage but warm enough to prevent freezing. Meat preservation involved smoking, salting, and drying techniques that transformed fresh protein into shelf-stable supplies that could sustain families through winter months. Shelter preparation meant identifying and repairing every weakness in barn and house structures before cold weather tested these defenses beyond their limits. Medieval farmers spent autumn days climbing on roofs to replace damaged thatch, stuffing gaps in walls with insulating materials, and reinforcing door and window systems that would face months of abuse from winter weather. These weren't cosmetic improvements. They were structural modifications that could prevent catastrophic heating system failures during severe cold. Animal preparation involved ensuring livestock could survive months of harsh conditions when pasture feeding was impossible, and shelter was their only protection from deadly weather. Barns had to be reinforced to handle increased animal occupancy. Feed supplies had to be calculated and stored to sustain livestock through extended periods when natural food sources were unavailable. Animal health had to be optimized before winter, because sick animals often couldn't survive harsh conditions that healthy livestock could endure. Clothing and bedding preparation required gathering, cleaning, and repairing every textile material the family possessed, because winter survival demanded every available piece of fabric for insulation and warmth. Wool had to be cleaned and processed for maximum insulating efficiency. Damaged clothing needed repair before it became completely unusable. Additional bedding materials like straw and hay had to be gathered and stored for use during the coldest months. Tool maintenance and backup preparation ensured that essential survival equipment would function reliably throughout winter months when replacement or repair might be impossible. Cutting tools needed sharpening and protection from rust. Fire-starting materials required testing and backup supply creation. Emergency tool caches had to be established and positioned for access during severe weather conditions that might prevent normal tool retrieval. Water system preparation involved ensuring access to unfrozen water throughout winter months when natural water sources could become solid ice for extended periods. Wells needed protection from freezing. Water storage systems required winterization that could prevent containers from cracking when contents froze. Ice-breaking tools and techniques needed preparation for situations where all water sources became frozen solid. Medical supply preparation recognized that winter injuries and illnesses often couldn't receive external medical treatment, forcing families to become self-sufficient medical providers during harsh weather months. Herbal medicines had to be gathered and processed while plants were still available. Basic medical supplies needed stockpiling for treating cold injuries, respiratory problems, and other winter-related health issues that could become life-threatening without treatment. Historians still argue whether medieval preparation cycles were more comprehensive than modern disaster preparedness efforts. But the scope and sophistication of autumn preparation activities demonstrate remarkable understanding of winter survival requirements. Medieval families consistently anticipated and prepared for challenges that modern people with heated homes and emergency services might not consider until crisis situations develop. Community coordination during preparation cycles allowed farming communities to share resources, knowledge, and labor that improved survival prospects for entire villages. Families with specialized skills might contribute to community preparation efforts in exchange for access to resources or assistance they couldn't provide independently. These mutual aid arrangements often determined which communities survived particularly harsh winters with minimal losses. Winter survival strategies varied dramatically across medieval Europe, with farmers in northern England developing techniques that would have seemed foreign to their counterparts in alpine regions, while mountain communities created innovations that would have puzzled lowland families. These weren't just minor variations in approach, they were fundamentally different survival philosophies shaped by climate's geography and available resources that required completely different skill sets and equipment for staying alive through harsh winter months. Northern England farmers faced winters characterized by penetrating dampness. Sudden temperature changes and wind patterns that could shift survival conditions from manageable to deadly within hours. Their barn survival techniques emphasized moisture management and rapid response to changing conditions. English farmers developed sophisticated ventilation systems that could be quickly adjusted as weather patterns shifted, preventing the dangerous accumulation of moisture that could compromise insulation while maintaining enough warmth to sustain life. The English approach to animal heat banking reflected their climate's unpredictable nature. Rather than static arrangements, Northern English farmers created flexible livestock positioning systems that could be rapidly reconfigured as conditions changed. Cattle and sheep could be moved within barn spaces to optimize heat distribution based on wind direction, temperature, and humidity levels that might shift multiple times during a single night. Alpine farming communities in regions that are now Switzerland, Austria, and northern Italy faced entirely different challenges that required survival techniques unknown to their lowland counterparts. Mountain winters brought extreme cold that was more predictable but potentially more deadly than English conditions. Alpine farmers developed intensive insulation techniques that created survival environments capable of functioning in temperatures that would have killed families using English survival methods. Alpine barn architecture reflected the need to survive extreme cold for extended periods. Mountain farmers often built partially underground structures that took advantage of Earth's natural insulation properties. These semi-subterranean barns required different ventilation strategies, heating approaches, and moisture management techniques that were specifically adapted to high-altitude winter conditions that could persist for months. The Alpine approach to fuel management was shaped by the scarcity of wood in high mountain environments, where trees were limited. Mountain farmers developed techniques for burning peat-dried grass and even carefully prepared animal dung that could provide sustained heat in environments where wood was too precious to use for routine heating. These alternative fuel strategies required different fire management skills and heating equipment that lowland farmers rarely needed. Scandinavian farming communities developed winter survival techniques that were influenced by even more extreme conditions and longer winter seasons. Nordic farmers created elaborate heating systems that could function during months of limited daylight and temperatures that regularly dropped far below anything experienced in more temperate regions. Their survival techniques emphasized resource conservation and efficiency that could sustain families through winter seasons that might last 6 months or longer. The Scandinavian approach to food preservation and rationing reflected the need to sustain families through extended winter periods when emergency food gathering was impossible. Nordic farmers developed sophisticated calculation systems that could accurately predict food consumption requirements and ration supplies with precision that ensured adequate nutrition through the longest possible winter conditions. Continental European farmers in regions that experienced harsh but relatively stable winter conditions developed survival techniques that emphasize systematic preparation and consistent implementation rather than rapid adaptation to changing conditions. These farmers created elaborate autumn preparation cycles that positioned families to survive predictable harsh conditions through systematic resource management and proven survival protocols. Historians still argue whether regional survival variations reflected environmental adaptation or cultural preferences, but the sophistication of region-specific techniques suggests that medieval farmers were remarkably skilled at developing survival strategies optimized for their particular environmental challenges. Communities that successfully adapted their techniques to local conditions had significantly better survival rates than those that attempted to use generic approaches. Knowledge transfer between regions occurred through trade contact, seasonal migration, and intermarriage that allowed successful survival techniques to spread across geographic boundaries. Alpine innovations in extreme cold survival might be adapted for use in northern England during particularly severe winters. English moisture management techniques could prove valuable in continental regions during unusually wet winter seasons. Some survival techniques proved universally applicable across different regions, while others were so specifically adapted to particular environmental conditions that they were useless or even dangerous when applied in different climates. Medieval farming communities gradually developed sophisticated understanding of which techniques could be transferred between regions and which required local adaptation or complete redesign for different environmental conditions. Regional survival variations created specialization opportunities where communities with particularly effective techniques could trade survival knowledge and materials with neighboring regions that had developed different expertise. These knowledge trading relationships often provided crucial backup resources that could save entire communities during years when local survival techniques proved inadequate for unusually severe conditions. Medieval farmers understood that surviving winter required more than just physical preparation. It demanded spiritual and folk medical practices that could provide both psychological comfort and practical health benefits during months when death stalked every family like a patient predator. These weren't superstitious rituals performed by ignorant peasants. They were sophisticated survival strategies that combined religious faith, herbal medicine, and community wisdom that had been tested through generations of brutal winter conditions. Prayer schedules during winter months became strategic survival tools that provided both spiritual comfort and practical timing for essential activities. Medieval farming families often aligned their daily prayers with critical survival tasks, morning prayers that coincided with fire revival and health assessment, evening prayers that prepared families mentally for dangerous overnight hours, and midnight prayers that could provide comfort during firewatch duties when fear and isolation threatened family morale. Religious protective rituals weren't just spiritual practices, they were psychological interventions that could prevent the despair and poor decision-making that often led to winter deaths. Blessing the barn before winter occupancy, consecrating fire-starting materials and maintaining religious observances that provided hope and community connection could mean the difference between families that maintained survival discipline and those that gave up when conditions became overwhelming. Herbal medicine practices during winter relied on plants and preparations that had been gathered during autumn months when medicinal materials were available. Medieval farmers maintained sophisticated knowledge of which herbs could treat respiratory problems caused by breathing cold air, which plants could improve circulation in extremities threatened by frostbite, and which preparations could provide internal warming that supplemented dietary heat generation. Garlic emerged as a winter survival superstar in medieval folk medicine used for treating everything from respiratory infections to circulation problems. Modern science recognizes that garlic does indeed have antimicrobial and circulation-enhancing properties, suggesting that medieval farmers had empirically discovered legitimate medical treatments through centuries of trial and error. Families often consumed large quantities of garlic during winter months, both for its medicinal properties and for its warming effects. Willow bark preparations provided pain relief for winter-related injuries and illnesses containing compounds that modern medicine recognizes as natural aspirin precursors. Medieval farmers didn't understand the biochemistry, but they knew that willow bark preparations could reduce the pain and inflammation associated with frostbite arthritis exacerbated by cold conditions and other winter health problems that could become debilitating without treatment. Honey was treasured not just as a sweetener, but as a comprehensive winter medicine that could treat sore throats, provide energy for heat generation, and even serve as antiseptic treatment for wounds that healed slowly in cold conditions. Medieval farmers often prepared honey-based medicinal preparations that combined multiple herbs with honey's natural preservative and therapeutic properties, creating winter medicine chests that could address various survival-related health issues. Aromatherapy practices using whatever fragrant materials could be gathered provided both psychological comfort and potentially legitimate respiratory benefits during long winter months spent in poorly ventilated barn environments. Burning herbs using scented oils when available and creating pleasant aromas in sleeping areas could improve air quality while providing sensory experiences that countered the monotony and stress of survival conditions. Massage and physical therapy techniques helped maintain circulation and muscle function during months when physical activity was limited by survival priorities and extreme conditions. Medieval farmers developed massage techniques using available oils or fats that could improve circulation in extremities, treat muscle stiffness caused by sleeping in cramped positions, and provide physical comfort that supported mental health during isolating winter months. Historians still argue whether medieval folk medicine was effective or merely psychologically comforting, but modern analysis of many traditional remedies reveals legitimate therapeutic properties that would have provided real health benefits. Medieval farmers seem to have empirically discovered numerous plant-based treatments that modern pharmacology recognizes as medically sound, suggesting sophisticated practical knowledge gained through careful observation. Community healing practices during winter created support networks that provided both medical assistance and social connection during months when isolation could be as deadly as cold exposure. Families with specialized medical knowledge might serve entire communities sharing treatments and expertise that improved survival rates for villages that maintained these mutual aid medical systems. Spiritual practices that emphasize gratitude, hope, and community connection provided psychological resilience that was essential for surviving months of harsh conditions that could break individual and family morale. Medieval farmers understood that mental health was as critical as physical health. For winter survival, developing religious and spiritual practices that sustained hope and determination through the darkest and most challenging months. Protective charms and talismans weren't just superstitious accessories, they were psychological tools that provided confidence and courage that could influence survival behavior. Families that maintained strong faith in their protective practices often demonstrated better survival discipline and decision-making than those who faced winter without spiritual or psychological support systems. Medieval farmers possessed weather prediction skills that would impress modern meteorologists reading natural signs with scientific precision that often provided more accurate local forecasts than distant weather stations could offer. These weren't mystical abilities or folk superstitions, they were empirically developed observation techniques that could predict dangerous weather conditions hours or days in advance, providing crucial preparation time that often meant the difference between life and death during winter's most treacherous moments. Cloud formation patterns became the medieval farmer's primary atmospheric intelligence source, with experienced weather watchers able to predict storm intensity, duration, and timing based on subtle changes in cloud color movement and structure. High thin clouds that developed a peculiar luminous quality often indicated severe cold fronts approaching within 12 to 24 hours. Low heavy clouds with specific color variations could predict whether incoming storms would bring snow-freezing rain or the deadly combination of both that created the most dangerous survival conditions. Wind direction changes provided another layer of weather intelligence that medieval farmers learned to interpret with remarkable accuracy. Sudden shifts in wind patterns, particularly when combined with specific temperature and humidity changes, could indicate major weather system movements that would bring dramatically different conditions within hours. Farmers developed techniques for detecting subtle wind changes that occurred before human senses could normally perceive them, using smoke patterns, plant movement, and even dust behavior to read atmospheric conditions. Animal behavior integration into weather prediction created sophisticated early warning systems that combined multiple natural indicators for enhanced forecasting accuracy. When several animal species simultaneously displayed specific behavioral changes, cattle huddling, horses becoming restless birds seeking unusual shelter, experienced farmers could predict severe weather with accuracy that often exceeded human meteorological observations alone. Atmospheric pressure sensitivity was developed by medieval farmers who learned to recognize the physical sensations that accompanied barometric pressure changes preceding major weather events. Joint pain, headaches, and subtle changes in breathing comfort could indicate pressure drops that preceded storms by 24 to 48 hours. Some individuals became so sensitive to pressure changes that they could predict weather more accurately than modern barometric instruments. Plant and vegetation observation provided additional weather intelligence that medieval farmers incorporated into comprehensive forecasting systems. Trees that showed unusual leaf movement patterns, grass that behaved differently in seemingly normal conditions, and even the behavior of moss and lichens could indicate atmospheric changes that preceded dangerous weather conditions. These botanical indicators often provided the longest-range weather predictions available to medieval communities. Seasonal pattern recognition allowed experienced farmers to predict not just immediate weather changes, but longer-term winter severity based on autumn and early winter indicators. The timing of first frosts, the behavior of migrating birds, the thickness of animal fur development, and dozens of other seasonal signals could help farmers predict whether the coming winter would be mild, severe, or catastrophically harsh. Traditional weather wisdom passed down through generations provided medieval farmers with accumulated forecasting knowledge that represented centuries of empirical observation and testing. Weather sayings and predictive rhymes weren't quaint folklore. They were compressed scientific knowledge that encoded legitimate meteorological observations in memorable formats that could be accurately transmitted across generations. Emergency weather prediction techniques were essential for situations where normal observation methods weren't providing adequate warning of rapidly developing dangerous conditions. Medieval farmers developed intensive observation protocols that could detect immediate weather threats, when standard prediction methods suggested conditions should remain stable, providing crucial last-minute warnings that could save lives during unexpected severe weather events. Historians still argue whether medieval weather prediction was as accurate as its practitioners claimed, but contemporary accounts suggest that experienced weather watchers often provided forecasts that were more accurate than modern meteorological services can achieve for local conditions. Medieval farmers had the advantage of intimate familiarity with microclimates and local weather patterns that broad-scale forecasting systems might miss. Regional specialization in weather prediction created knowledge networks, where communities with particularly skilled weather watchers could share forecasting intelligence with neighboring areas that might have different meteorological expertise. These information-sharing relationships often provided advance warning of severe weather systems that affected large geographic areas, improving survival preparation for entire regions. Backup prediction methods were essential, because weather forecasting failure during medieval winters could have catastrophic consequences for unprepared families. Farmers developed multiple independent forecasting techniques that could provide redundant weather intelligence, ensuring that dangerous conditions would be detected even if primary prediction methods failed or provided inaccurate information. Training and knowledge transfer of weather prediction skills was critical for ensuring that communities maintained forecasting capabilities across generations. Young farmers learned weather observation techniques through intensive apprenticeship programs that combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience, creating succession plans that preserved vital survival knowledge even when experienced weather watchers were lost to disease injury or age. When the first tentative warmth of spring finally began to loosen winter's death grip on medieval farming, families faced the sobering task of conducting survival assessments that would determine whether their winter strategies had been successful or whether they had paid prices that might affect their prospects for years to come. Spring wasn't a celebration. It was an audit conducted in weak sunlight that revealed both triumphs and tragedies that had been hidden beneath months of snow and survival desperation. The human accounting came first because family members were the most precious resources that winter could claim or spare. Medieval families conducted careful health assessments that went far beyond simple head counts of who had survived until spring. Cold injuries that had seemed manageable during winter's worst months might have developed into permanent disabilities that would affect family work capacity for the remainder of the year. Respiratory damage from breathing frozen air could manifest as chronic coughing or breathing difficulties that might persist through summer months. Children received the most thorough spring health evaluations because their developing bodies were most vulnerable to winter's long-term effects. Growth that had been stunted by inadequate nutrition during lean winter months might never be fully recovered. Learning and development that had been delayed by survival priorities needed assessment to determine whether educational goals could be resumed or required permanent adjustment based on winter's developmental impact. Livestock assessment revealed whether animal survival strategies had preserved the foundation of family agricultural capacity, or whether winter losses would require desperate measures to rebuild farming operations. Cattle that had survived might have suffered milk production decreases that would affect family nutrition and income throughout the coming year. Horses that had made it through winter might have developed work capacity limitations that would compromise spring planting and agricultural productivity. Infrastructure evaluation determined whether barn and shelter modifications had successfully protected family survival systems or whether critical repairs were needed before the next winter season. Structural damage that had been temporarily patched during survival emergencies needed permanent repair before it became catastrophic. Heating systems that had functioned adequately during crisis conditions might require rebuilding to ensure reliability during future winter seasons. Food supply assessment revealed whether winter rationing strategies had successfully preserved adequate nutrition, or whether families faced spring hunger that could affect their ability to plant, tend and harvest crops that would determine the following winter's survival prospects. Seed grain that had been consumed during desperate winter months would need replacement, that might require borrowing, trading or other arrangements that could create long-term obligations affecting family prosperity. Tool and equipment inventory determined whether essential implements had survived winter use without damage that would compromise spring agricultural activities. Cutting tools that had been overused during fuel preparation might need replacement or repair before they could function adequately for farming tasks. Fire-starting materials that had been depleted during survival activities needed replenishment before the next winter season. Community relationships required evaluation to determine whether mutual aid arrangements during winter had created obligations or strengthened bonds that would influence future survival planning. Families that had received assistance during crisis periods might need to provide reciprocal support to neighbours who had helped them survive. Communities that had successfully implemented cooperative survival strategies might formalise arrangements that could improve future winter survival prospects. Psychological and emotional assessment was equally important because winter survival stress could create lasting mental health effects that would influence family functioning throughout the coming year. Depression, anxiety, and trauma responses to near-death experiences during winter months might require community support and healing activities that could restore family emotional stability and cooperation. Historians still argue whether medieval spring assessments were formal evaluation processes or simply practical necessity responses, but contemporary accounts suggest that successful farming families consistently conducted systematic reviews of winter outcomes that guided planning for future survival challenges. Families that failed to learn from winter experiences often repeated mistakes that proved fatal during subsequent harsh seasons. Knowledge updating based on winter survival experiences created opportunities for families and communities to improve their preparation and survival techniques for future winter challenges. Innovations that had proved successful during the past winter could be refined and systematized for broader application. Strategies that had failed could be abandoned in favor of alternative approaches that might provide better survival outcomes. Planning for the next winter cycle began immediately after spring survival assessment was complete, because medieval farmers understood that successful winter survival required year-round preparation and resource management. Autumn preparation schedules had to be adjusted based on winter survival outcomes, available resources, and lessons learned from the survival experiences that families had just completed. Resource allocation for recovery and future preparation required careful balance between immediate spring needs and long-term winter survival requirements. Families had to invest in current year agricultural activities while also beginning the accumulation and preparation activities that would determine their prospects for surviving the next winter season that would arrive with inevitable persistence. The ancient wisdom of medieval barn sleeping hasn't disappeared. It has evolved and adapted into modern survival techniques that continue to save lives in ways that would make those desperate farming families proud. From military training facilities to emergency shelters, the fundamental principles that kept medieval farmers alive through brutal winters persist in contemporary applications, proving that human ingenuity in the face of deadly cold transcends both centuries and technology. Modern military survival training incorporates techniques that would be instantly recognizable to medieval farmers who shared barn space with livestock for warmth. Special forces units learn to use animal body heat for survival in extreme conditions, understanding that a horse or cow can provide life-saving warmth when technological heating systems fail. Military survival manuals teach body heat sharing techniques that are direct descendants of medieval family sleeping arrangements that kept entire households alive through frozen nights. The US Army's Cold Weather Operations Manual specifically includes instructions for warming tent configurations that replicate medieval barn sleeping arrangements. Soldiers learn to position themselves in concentric circles, with the coldest individuals in the center, using shared body heat and breath-warming techniques that medieval families developed out of necessity. These aren't historical curiosities, they're proven survival strategies that work as effectively today as they did 7 centuries ago. Emergency preparedness communities study medieval winter survival techniques as proven strategies for situations where modern infrastructure fails catastrophically. When power grids collapse during ice storms, when natural gas systems freeze, or when supply chains break down during severe weather, the basic survival principles that sustained medieval farming families become immediately relevant. Modern emergency planners recognize that these ancient techniques provide backup survival capabilities that don't depend on technology or external resources. The 2021 Texas winter storm that left millions without power and heat saw spontaneous applications of medieval survival principles as families gathered in single rooms, shared body heat, and used primitive heating methods to survive conditions that killed over 200 people. Emergency responders reported that families who implemented communal warming strategies had significantly better survival outcomes than those who tried to maintain individual comfort in separate rooms. Contemporary homesteading and off-grid living communities have rediscovered many medieval barn sleeping principles, adapting ancient techniques for modern contexts. Today's sustainable living advocates build animal-integrated housing systems that use livestock body heat for residential warming, creating energy-efficient homes that operate on the same thermal principles medieval farmers developed. These modern applications often prove more effective than high-tech heating systems, while using a fraction of the energy resources. Arctic research stations and polar exploration teams use survival techniques that are direct applications of medieval barn sleeping principles. Scientists and explorers in extreme environments share sleeping quarters, use communal body heat, and implement watch systems that are essentially identical to the survival strategies medieval farming families developed for winter barn living. The McMurdo Station in Antarctica uses communal sleeping arrangements and shared heating systems that would be familiar to any medieval farmer. Bushcraft and wilderness survival training programs teach students to read animal behavior for weather prediction using the same observation techniques that medieval farmers relied upon for advance warning of dangerous conditions. Modern survival instructors understand that animals possess sensory capabilities that electronic weather monitoring can't match for local immediate condition, changes that could prove life-threatening for people caught unprepared in wilderness environments. The Outward Bound survival program includes modules specifically based on medieval farming survival techniques, teaching students to create shared sleeping systems, manage communal fires, and implement watch rotations that mirror the strategies medieval families used during barn sleeping. These programs consistently demonstrate that ancient survival wisdom often outperforms modern technological solutions during genuine survival emergencies. Disaster relief organizations have begun incorporating medieval community survival principles into their emergency response protocols. The American Red Cross now includes guidance for communal warming centers that use body heat sharing watch systems and resource pooling strategies that are directly derived from medieval barn sleeping techniques. These applications prove that the fundamental principles remain valid regardless of technological advancement. Modern therapeutic communities have discovered that the social bonding and mutual support systems medieval families developed for psychological survival during months of isolation provide mental health benefits that contemporary isolated living often lacks. Some therapeutic programs now implement shared sleeping spaces and communal care arrangements that recreate the emotional resilience systems medieval barn sleeping families developed. International humanitarian organizations working in refugee situations have found that medieval barn sleeping principles provide effective solutions for emergency shelter situations where modern heating systems aren't available. The communal warming techniques, resource sharing protocols, and watch systems that medieval farmers developed translate directly into effective refugee camp management strategies that can save lives during harsh weather emergencies. The scientific validation of medieval survival techniques continues to surprise researchers who discover that ancient survival wisdom often exceeds modern technological solutions in effectiveness and efficiency. Studies of thermal regulation, community psychology, and stress survival consistently support the strategies that medieval farmers developed through empirical observation and desperate necessity. Modern science has finally caught up with survival wisdom that was tested in life or death conditions centuries ago. These direct applications of medieval barn sleeping wisdom demonstrate that fundamental human survival needs transcend technological advancement. The desperate farming families who huddled together in straw-filled barns, sharing warmth and watching over each other through winter's deadliest nights, discovered survival principles that remain as relevant today as they were when winter meant the difference between life and death for entire communities. Modern scientific research has revealed something remarkable about medieval barn sleeping techniques. They weren't just desperate survival measures, they were sophisticated applications of thermal dynamics, psychology, and human physiology that often exceed the effectiveness of contemporary heating and social systems. Laboratory studies, field research, and medical analysis have validated medieval survival wisdom with precision that would have amazed the farming families who developed these techniques through trial error and the constant threat of freezing to death. Thermal imaging studies of recreated medieval sleeping arrangements demonstrate heat distribution patterns that modern engineers struggle to replicate using technological systems. When researchers measured the temperature variations in authentic medieval-style communal sleeping configurations, they discovered that central positions remained 15 to 20 degrees warmer than ambient temperatures, while even outer positions maintained temperatures 8 to 10 degrees above baseline. These results exceeded the heating efficiency of many modern residential systems while using zero external energy sources. Sleep laboratory research has validated the psychological benefits of shared sleeping arrangements that medieval families used for survival. Studies measuring cortisol levels, REM sleep patterns, and stress indicators consistently show that people sleeping in communal arrangements experience lower anxiety, deeper sleep, and better stress recovery than individuals sleeping in isolation. Medieval farmers had unknowingly discovered therapeutic sleeping arrangements that modern sleep medicine is only beginning to understand. Respiratory studies comparing medieval breathing techniques with modern cold air exposure protocols reveal that the controlled breathing methods medieval farmers developed for surviving extreme cold provide measurable protection against respiratory trauma. Pulmonary function tests show that people using medieval nose breathing and cloth filtering techniques maintain better oxygen saturation and experience less respiratory inflammation when exposed to extremely cold air than those using contemporary cold weather breathing methods. Nutritional analysis of medieval winter survival diets demonstrates remarkable sophistication in understanding metabolism and heat generation. Modern dietary thermogenesis research confirms that medieval farmers had empirically discovered optimal food combinations for maximizing internal heat production. Their emphasis on dense root vegetables, complex carbohydrates, and strategic fat consumption aligns perfectly with contemporary knowledge of how different nutrients affect body temperature regulation and sustained energy production. Biomechanical studies of medieval layered clothing systems reveal insulation efficiency that rivals modern technical outerwear. When researchers tested authentic medieval winter clothing configurations using thermal mannequins and environmental chambers, they discovered that properly implemented medieval layering provided thermal protection equivalent to modern mountaineering gear while using entirely natural materials. The air-trapping techniques medieval farmers developed match engineering principles that modern insulation designers use for extreme condition equipment. Psychological resilience research has identified specific mental health benefits in medieval community survival strategies that modern therapeutic interventions attempt to replicate. Studies of stress response, social bonding, and crisis adaptation consistently show that communities implementing medieval-style mutual aid, shared responsibility, and collective problem-solving develop superior psychological resilience compared to groups relying on individual coping strategies. Animal behavior research validates medieval weather prediction techniques with surprising accuracy. Modern ethological studies confirm that livestock and farm animals can detect atmospheric pressure changes, electromagnetic variations, and other environmental shifts that precede severe weather by 24-48 hours. Scientific measurement of animal sensory capabilities supports medieval farmers' reliance on animal behavior for weather forecasting, proving that these techniques provided legitimate meteorological intelligence. Fire management studies comparing medieval heating techniques with modern combustion systems reveal efficiency advantages that contemporary engineers are trying to incorporate into new heating technologies. Medieval fire banking methods, fuel selection strategies, and heat distribution techniques often achieved better thermal efficiency and resource conservation than modern heating systems. Some contemporary wood stove manufacturers now incorporate medieval fire management principles into their designs. Circadian rhythm research explains why medieval watch rotation systems were physiologically optimal for maintaining alertness and health during extended survival situations. Studies of sleep cycles, hormone production, and cognitive function demonstrate that the watch schedules medieval families developed naturally aligned with human biological rhythms in ways that maximized alertness while minimizing health impacts from sleep disruption. Medical research on hypothermia treatment and cold injury management consistently validates medieval warming techniques as medically sound interventions that align with current emergency medicine protocols. The gradual warming methods, skin-to-skin contact therapy, and circulation restoration techniques medieval farmers used match contemporary hypothermia treatment guidelines, suggesting sophisticated empirical understanding of human physiology. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers understood the scientific principles behind their survival techniques, but research consistently demonstrates that their practical applications were remarkably sophisticated and scientifically sound. These weren't primitive survival methods, they were refined technologies that addressed complex human needs with elegant efficiency that modern science is only beginning to fully appreciate. Beyond the practical techniques and scientific validation lies something deeper that medieval barn-sleeping families discovered during those long cold nights, a profound understanding of what it means to be human when everything else is stripped away. In the flickering firelight, surrounded by the breath of animals and the quiet murmur of sleeping children, these families found truths about resilience, connection, and hope that transcend any single winter and speak to the eternal human condition of facing darkness together. The eternal winter isn't just about cold, it's about any circumstance that threatens to overwhelm human strength and spirit. Medieval farmers understood that survival wasn't merely about maintaining body temperature. It was about keeping alive something essential in the human soul that could carry families through not just harsh seasons, but harsh years, harsh decades, and the inevitable hardships that define mortal existence. Their barn-sleeping techniques were as much spiritual practice as survival strategy. In the forced intimacy of shared survival, medieval families discovered relationship dynamics that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. When personal space becomes a luxury you can't afford, when privacy disappears under the weight of collective need, when individual desires must yield to group survival, people learn to find comfort and meaning in human connection that goes deeper than social convention or personal preference. These families created bonds forged not in comfort but in shared vulnerability. The rhythm of medieval barn sleeping created a different relationship with time that offers wisdom for our hurried modern world. Winter nights were long, but they weren't empty. They were filled with the deep patience required for tending fires, watching over loved ones, and waiting for dawn with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're doing everything possible to protect what matters most. These families learned to find peace in the present moment, even when that moment was uncomfortable and uncertain. Medieval farmers developed an understanding of interdependence that challenges modern notions of individual autonomy and self-reliance. In barn sleeping arrangements, everyone's survival literally depended on everyone else's actions, the fire tender's vigilance, the weather watcher's observations, the heat generator's position, the lookout's alertness. These families discovered that true strength comes not from independence, but from the willing embrace of mutual responsibility and shared fate. The spiritual dimensions of medieval barn sleeping extended beyond religious practice into a deep acceptance of human limitation and natural rhythm that modern life often struggles to accommodate. These families learn to surrender to winter's demands without surrendering hope to accept hardship, without accepting defeat to endure suffering while maintaining faith in eventual renewal. Their survival techniques were simultaneously practical methods and spiritual disciplines. Children raised in medieval barn-sleeping environments developed psychological resilience that equipped them not just for future winters but for life's inevitable challenges. They learned early that comfort is temporary, that security comes from relationships rather than circumstances, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act responsibly despite fear. These children carried forward wisdom about human strength that no comfortable childhood could provide. The community bonds created by shared winter survival extended far beyond seasonal necessity into lifetime relationships that sustained entire villages through decades of challenge. Families who had shared body heat divided scarce resources and watched over each other through dangerous nights developed trust and cooperation that became the foundation for resilient communities capable of surviving any crisis together. Medieval barn-sleeping families understood something profound about hope that modern optimism often misses. Their hope wasn't based on the expectation that conditions would improve quickly or that solutions would appear from outside sources. Their hope was rooted in the demonstrated human capacity to endure, adapt, and find meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. This hope proved more durable than hope based on external circumstances. The legacy of medieval barn sleeping reminds us that human beings possess reserves of strength, creativity, and love that emerge most clearly when survival demands everything we have to give. These families discovered that when you're fighting for your life, you're also fighting for your humanity, and that the fight itself reveals capacities for courage, wisdom, and connection that comfortable circumstances never call forth. Historians still argue whether medieval life was harder or easier than modern existence, but the barn-sleeping families leave us with enduring testimony about human potential that transcends historical comparison. They proved that people can maintain dignity, love, and hope under conditions that would challenge anyone's faith in human resilience. Their legacy lives in every act of courage, every gesture of mutual aid, every moment when people choose connection over isolation. The eternal winter comes to every generation in different forms: economic collapse, pandemic, isolation, environmental crisis, personal tragedy, social upheaval. But the wisdom discovered in medieval barns remains constant. We survive not by avoiding hardship, but by facing it together, not by maintaining individual comfort, but by creating shared warmth, not by waiting for rescue, but by becoming the strength we need. As the story of medieval barn sleeping draws to its close, you can feel the gentle settling that comes when deep truths have been shared and ancient wisdom has been honoured. The techniques and strategies, the scientific validation, and modern applications all fade into something simpler and more enduring. The quiet understanding that human warmth, both physical and emotional, remains our most powerful protection against any winter that life brings our way. The medieval farmers who mastered barn sleeping have long since returned to the earth they worked so hard to survive upon, but their legacy lives on in every gesture of mutual care, every act of shared courage, every moment when people choose to face the darkness together rather than alone. Their barns have crumbled, their straw has scattered, their fires have long since turned to ash. But the warmth they created through community and determination continues to glow in the human heart. Tonight, as you settle into your own warm space, whether it's a heated bedroom, a cozy living room, or perhaps your own version of a shared survival shelter, you carry forward the spirit of those ancient winter warriors. You understand now that true warmth comes not from technology or luxury, but from the connections we create and maintain with each other, the wisdom we share across generations, and the courage we find to keep the fires burning, both literal and metaphorical, through whatever winters we face. The breath of sleeping animals, the crackle of banking fires, the whispered prayers of grateful families. These echoes of medieval nights remind us that survival is always about more than just staying alive. It's about staying human, staying connected, staying hopeful, even when the darkness seems endless and the cold feels eternal. It's about understanding that we are never truly alone as long as we remember how to share warmth with others who need it. Rest now knowing that you are part of an unbroken chain of human resilience that stretches back through centuries of survival and forward into whatever challenges await. The barn sleepers taught us that winter always ends, that dawn always comes, and that the warmth we create together can outlast any cold that tries to claim us. Sleep well, wrapped in the comfort of this ancient wisdom, and the eternal truth that love shared is warmth, multiplied beyond any fire's capacity to provide. In the quietest hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between darkness and light, you can almost hear them still, the gentle breathing of families who refused to surrender to winter's assault, who chose warmth over cold together, over a lone hope over despair. Their victory echoes in your own peaceful rest, their courage lives in your own daily choices, and their warmth continues to glow wherever human beings choose to care for each other through life's longest nights. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.